Hello, and welcome to our session using a self-monitoring platform called IConnect to target learning, social, emotional, and behavioral goals. My name is Gretchen Scheibel, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Kansas and an implementation coordinator with Juniper Gardens Children's Project. Today, we'll give you a quick introduction into what IConnect is and how it helps students to engage in self-monitoring to meet their goals. Our session today will be presented in 3 parts. First, Dr. Howard Wills will present a quick review of self-monitoring and introduce you to IConnect. Next, I will present a step-by-step guide for how to use IConnect with your students. And finally, John Augustine will join us to share his experience using IConnect with a student at home during virtual learning. We're really excited you're here and look forward to learning with you.
Hi, I'm Howard Wills from University of Kansas Juniper Gardens Children's Project. I'm going to give a brief overview of what self-monitoring is and an introduction to IConnect. Self-monitoring is a process where a teacher can teach a student to observe their own behavior, and then students record simply if the behavior has occurred or not. For example, a student can record or count how many times a behavior takes place, such as Nina using chips in a cup to record how many times she raises her hand, or Levi marking tallies on a sheet when he turns in an assignment. Another method of self-monitoring is to track if a behavior took place within a specific time period. For example, at the end of a period, Taylor could decide if she used a quiet voice and mark this on a chart or form. This type of self-monitoring can also utilize a rating, such as may be seen in check-in, check-out interventions, in the form that a student can mark a degree to which an expectation has been met. So a happy face, a mid face, or a sad face, or a 3, 2, 1. Finally, self-monitoring can be used to track if a behavior is taking place at a specific time. For example, Jake has a timer that vibrates every 4 minutes, and if he then marks his sheet at the end of that interval, at the end of each 4-minute interval, whether he's been in a seat or not. Early technology, such as this motivator, was used to cue or prompt a student of when to record. More recently, technology has been used with a growing number of apps on the market that in various ways can be used to aid self-monitoring. Overall, there's been a strong evidence base over the last 30 years supporting the use of self-monitoring. A 2020 review of this literature noted that there's, in the self-monitoring literature, strong evidence to support increased engagement and a decrease in disruptive behaviors. With interval lengths, when intervals were appropriate, for generally less than 5 minutes. This particular review notes that technology-based self-monitoring has great advantages, and that reinforcement can be used to strengthen effects when in combination with self-monitoring. Overall, the evidence supports self-monitoring to be used across ages, genders, disabilities, and settings. So this brings me to the start of a brief introduction to IConnect. IConnect, the resources can all be found at iconnect.ku.edu, a website that has all training materials and information on how to get started and what it is and the evidence behind it. So IConnect is freely available. It's a self-monitoring platform that's highly customizable. It easily records progress monitoring, and it can be used to support collaboration. This development of this app and this platform has been supported by NIDLR and by OSA. So this self-monitoring platform allows students to observe and record their own behavior and educators to track and monitor that progress. So it has 2 parts. There's a web portal This is the website where you can create student accounts. You can set target behaviors and the interval lengths that the students will record. You can set a goal for them to progress. So you can set it at 80% or 90%. And you can identify stakeholders to share information with. This is also the place where you can view graphs of progress. On the app side, the app allows for the student to monitor, such as the picture here showing, are you on task, with the yes or no buttons that they would press. As soon as they press that, it's going to record it in the database system and wait till the next interval to pop up this message again, or this prompt to record. The app can also be used to view graphs. This application is available on Android and iPhone, or Apple markets, Android and Apple markets. We have a version then also that can be used on MacBooks and a version on Chromebooks. A quick example of using IConnect, this is with a high school student with autism, and the student struggled with staying on task during independent work. So you can see during baseline that Carl's rates of engagement were low. With the use of IConnect intervention, that immediately increased. And for study purposes, we removed that intervention for a brief period. It went back down to baseline levels, and then we reinstated it. So strong support for IConnect helping Carl stay engaged. We also examined the effect of IConnect on task completion. In this study, task completion was measured as a secondary variable. So Carl was using IConnect to monitor his own on-task behavior, but while he recorded the on-task, we saw an immediate increase in his task completion as well. The effects that we see with Carl are consistent with the majority of the literature base for IConnect. Currently, IConnect has been investigated in 9 peer-reviewed studies and additional dissertations. These studies included 19 students and adults with disabilities, and improvement was seen in on-task behavior, academic, and behavior outcomes. Additional resources regarding the evidence base for IConnect can be found at the website iconnect.ku.edu.
Great, and thank you, Dr. Wills. Now that you have a little introductory knowledge into self-monitoring and IConnect, let's talk about how you can use IConnect with your students. IConnect is implemented in 3 steps. First, the mentor meets with the student to select a target behavior and interval, and then the mentor trains the student to self-monitor using IConnect. Next, the student uses IConnect in at least one class or pretty regularly. And lastly, the mentor meets with the student at least once a week, or again, pretty regularly, to review progress, make adjustments, and celebrate successes. All that we're going to cover today can be found in greater detail in our user guide. Our user guides are really useful. They're really detailed. They go over what we're going to talk about today with the different steps of using IConnect, but it also goes over ways to individualize IConnect for students with more extensive support needs or students who are having trouble and are not responding to IConnect. The user guide for implementing IConnect in your classroom can be found at iconnect.ku.edu/mentor user guide. Okay, so in that first step, when you're selecting a target behavior, it's helpful to think about a behavior that's going to have the biggest impact for the student or the student will be most successful with. The difference between those two is that you want to either pick a behavior that is going to be really meaningful to the student, that's going to make a big change in their life, or if students are just learning how to self-monitor and are not entirely aware of their own behavior, you might pick an easier behavior for them to become aware of, to learn how to self-monitor, and then move on to another behavior that's going to have a bigger impact on the student. It's important when you're selecting this target behavior to involve the student in the process. Again, they're an integral part of this process, right? They're the ones who are going to be self-monitoring. And research shows that the more that we include them at this stage in the identifying the target behavior, even defining the target behavior and writing the prompt as to, what pops up on the screen, the more that we can involve them at that stage, the more engaged they're going to be and the more responsive they're going to be to the intervention. So you're going to select a target behavior, which might be something like staying on task when working on math. And what that translates to is to the prompt that the student sees on the screen. So you're not going to write, are you on task while you're working on math for the prompt that pops up on the screen? You're going to translate that into the question or the prompt that the student is going to see. So that behavior of staying on task when working on math would easily translate into, are you on task? Next, you want to select a monitoring interval. This interval refers to how often the student will see the prompt pop up on the screen. And the interval itself is really important, right? It's what's really helping or guiding the student to become more aware of their own behavior. So it's important to start with maybe a smaller interval, which would translate to more frequent prompts, and that will help the student to build momentum. So they'll be able to answer yes to the prompt more often because you're starting with a smaller, easier interval. Before you select the interval, you can observe the student to see how long they can maintain the target behavior for, and then maybe set the first interval for a little below this. There's no guidance, again, for what the right interval is for a certain behavior or a certain student. It's really set on the student's performance. So you may have a student who is able to focus for about 5 minutes, and you can set the first interval for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, right? So it's just a little bit under that. So they're getting that prompt, like a preemptive prompt ahead of time. It's important to observe the student to find that out. I think a lot of times as teachers, we think, oh my gosh, that kiddo cannot stay on task for more than 30 seconds. Like, I swear I prompt him all the time. It might be 30 seconds, it might be less than that, it could be more than that. That's why it's really helpful to do that quick observation. You could do more than one observation, you could do a couple and just kind of take an average, but that observation is pretty important when you're setting up that interval. The last part of setting up the intervention before you start training the student is setting up a performance goal. And that's the goal that the student sees when they're looking at that chart that says, have they met their goal, yes or no? And really what the goal is how many times is the student going to answer yes to that prompt? So how many times during the monitoring session are they going to be demonstrating the target behavior you want to see? It's really important to remember that very rarely do kids demonstrate a target behavior 100% of a monitoring interval. Not just kids with disabilities or kids who are using IConnect, but really anybody. Most people don't do things at 100%. So set a goal that's kind of more comparable to what peers are doing. Or that is what the student wants to see. So I think on-task behavior is a really good example of this. Most students aren't on task for 100% of the time, but most kids in most classrooms are on task for roughly 80% of the time. So you might see a goal of 80% for a student who's monitoring on task. If you're having a difficulty figuring out what that goal would be, then you can always have the student use IConnect first, just see where their baseline is, just see where they're at. You might move the goal up incrementally each week if you're not happy with where it is. Maybe their on task is 20% of the monitoring interval, and that's not great. And you want to see it go up to that 80%. You might every week move it up a little tiny bit so that the student is able to build momentum or gradually experience a little bit success. So those are the three big components, right? The prompt, the interval, and the goal when you're setting up IConnect. It's really important to remember that even though IConnect gives you prompts that are written in and it's really easy to pick the intervals and the goals, it's really important to individualize this for your students' needs. So we talked about this a little bit with the target behavior. Think about what it is that the student really needs help with. And, we wanted to give you an example of what this can look like. I think, are you on task is probably the most common prompt that we see. It's the most common thing that people use IConnect for. But there's lots of other behaviors that you can target using IConnect. This fall, students are going to be returning back to school after a pretty wonky year last school year. We have students who just haven't been engaged in instruction for long periods of time. We may have students who are experiencing symptoms of long COVID and are struggling with fatigue and exhaustion. And so one goal that you might have around learning is just taking a break throughout the instructional period just to reduce mental fatigue. And again, you wouldn't write a prompt that says, are you feeling mentally fatigued? It's time to take a break. Instead, you might write a prompt that says, do you need a break? And you might set the interval for that to be 15 minutes. Because you don't want to ask a student if they need a break every 5 minutes or every 2 minutes. You might just check in every 15 minutes. How you doing? How you feeling? Let's see, do you need a break? And go from there. So you might set the interval for 15 minutes. You'll see on the slide, we have the words variable and fixed next to intervals. So there's two types of intervals. There's variable and fixed. In our user guide, we go through the difference between the two and when you might want to use them. So if that's information you're looking for, check it out in the user guide. Again, you can use IConnect with social emotional behaviors like asking for help. So you may have a prompt that says, do you need help? And you might set that interval for 10 minutes. And again, you might ask, set the goal pretty high at 80% because you want students to be able to figure out if they need help and request it, pretty quickly throughout the monitoring session. And you want them to respond appropriately to that 80% of the time. Lastly, probably again, the most common behavior that we see that's targeted using IConnect is attending or staying engaged or staying on task. So that prompt might be on task. And what I want to show you here is the interval for that might be significantly smaller than something like learning when to take a break or learning if you need help. So you might have a 2-minute interval, and that might be the amount of prompting that a student needs to stay on task. And you might have a really different goal for that. So the point here is to really individualize this to your student needs and make sure that it really is tailored to their unique circumstances. Okay, so once you've done that, the last thing to do is you want to train the student. You want to train them to accurately record if the behavior is occurring or not. That is essential, right? So especially if you're going to be adding any sort of reinforcement to this, or you're going to use this for data that you're going to report back out, you want to make sure that the student is accurately saying, yes, I'm on task. Yes, no, I don't need help, whatever it is, you want them to be able to accurately record so that you can make good decisions based on the data. But more importantly, or maybe not more importantly, but equally important to learning to accurately record is figuring out how to use the app. I think this is a really crucial step that sometimes we skip. And so it's just helping students learn how to navigate the app, how to, find where it is, how to get to the monitoring session, which is pretty easy, but sometimes kids need just a little introduction to that. Knowing when to start the monitoring session versus when to stop. Very important is when to pause. We have kiddos who go to the bathroom and leave the timer on, so leave the iConnect app running, and then it looks like they've missed a bunch of prompts because they've been in the bathroom the whole time. So just teaching kids things like that, knowing when to start, when to stop, when to pause, and then when to access those charts. So we did a meta-analysis recently to look at the different training methods that were used to train students to use IConnect. Most commonly, a behavior skills training or explicit instruction model was used. And these methods are great. They're models that I'm sure are familiar to lots of teachers, and they're really useful. Kids find them to be very effective to learn various skills. So first you introduce the rationale, then you provide some modeling with examples and non-example. You give them an opportunity to practice. You may have students practice to a criterion, so they have to demonstrate that they are able to monitor accurately to a certain percent before they're able to use the app without your help. And you want to try to offer positive feedback as well as corrective feedback. There's some supplemental methods that you can use to help students learn how to use iConnect. There's video self-models where you video the student just in the classroom, and then they use that video to learn how to monitor. So they monitor themselves watching the video. You can use online modules such as ASD on the Go that teaches students about what self-monitoring is. And you can always include discussion with this. So you can discuss the various points and reasons why, the rationale why this could be useful. So again, training is super dependent on the student that you have. Students with extensive support needs may require longer training, but we have had students who are using iConnect with pretty extensive support needs, and they were able to learn how to use the app and how to self-monitor pretty accurately in an average of 42 minutes. So there was a range of 20 minutes to 60 minutes total of training time in order for students to learn how to accurately monitor. And again, there's much more details in our user guide about how to go through that training process. But once the student has gone through that, you've identified the target behavior, you've set the interval, you've set the goal, you've trained the student, then what you really want to do is you want to have a student monitor. And while they're monitoring, again, this is a student-directed intervention. So as the teacher, you shouldn't need to do too much other than make sure they have the app, make sure it's started, and they're good to go. So one thing to do just as they're starting out is just try to keep a closer eye on it than you might in other situations, because you want to make sure that they're monitoring accurately, pausing the app when needed, and just provide them with a little bit of encouragement throughout. So once they've been monitoring for a little bit and you feel like things are going pretty good, that's when you get to step 3, where you meet with students to check in on their progress. So and Dr. Wills talked a little bit about this, and I referenced it earlier. iConnect comes with charts that auto-populate that show you the different monitoring sessions that a student has engaged in and the times that they've responded positively, negatively, or there's no response. And there should be a blue line, which is the goal line, right? So you may have a student who is monitoring, are you on task, like we have here in the example, and it shows that this student has monitored 4 times. All 4 times their positive responses were above the goal line, which is great, right? That's what we wanted. Now, again, this might look differently if you were monitoring something like, are you, or do you need help? Your negative responses might be higher, or do you need a break? So again, just whatever works for your student, however that works, but you can use this data to make all sorts of decisions. So meet with them, make sure that the student is meeting their goal. You may want to make some adjustments if they're not. You can always adjust the interval. You can adjust the target behavior. You can do some retraining if you need to. You can make all sorts of changes if, to the design of the intervention if you feel like the student isn't making progress. You want to check in and make sure the student is reporting satisfaction, that they feel like this is useful and that this is going well for them. And probably most importantly is, if the student is meeting their goal and they're saying, yeah, this is great, be sure that it is noticeably changing their behavior to an outside observer, to yourself. Again, that's where that accuracy piece comes in. It could be that the data looks great in the app. It looks like they're meeting their goal and they're saying, oh yeah, it's going great, but you're noticing that they are not any more on task than they previously were. And that means you might want to go back and do some training on accuracy. Okay, so once you've done all that, you're implementing iConnect, and it's going great. Another thing that we want to highlight is that iConnect gives you an opportunity to collaborate between home and school. So there's two ways that you can do this, and I kind of mentioned it before. As you're setting up iConnect in that web portal, you can opt to add a parent or an outside service provider as a stakeholder, meaning that that parent or that outside service provider has an account and a way to log into that web portal, and they can see those charts. So parents can watch their students' progress over time. Outside service providers can watch over time. And at the very end, I'll show you some resources where parents and outside service providers can also use iConnect so that you guys can compare. But another thing that you can do is use iConnect at home to encourage generalization. So you may be using iConnect at school to promote, a learning goal or a behavior goal, and you may have a parent also use iConnect at home to work on that same exact goal. And what that does is it just encourages generalization, right? So kiddo might get really good at monitoring their on-task behavior at school, and then they use it at home. And they start to stay on task more at home during homework sessions, which can be really beneficial. So those are two opportunities for collaborating between home and school. Now we're going to hear from John about his experience using iConnect at home when the school that he was working in while he was conducting his master's thesis went into virtual learning last spring.
Hello, my name is John Augustine, and I will be a doctoral student at Purdue University in the fall. The study I'm about to present to you was a master's thesis requirement in fulfillment of Missouri State University's Graduate College. To begin, individuals with autism spectrum disorders exhibit deficits in social communication and language and engage in persistent perseverative behaviors. It is imperative that we employ research-based practices and strategies within this population. Due to the nature and severity of this disorder, the need to implement research-based strategies such as iConnect within the home and school setting is critical for their development and future success. This is the first study that has investigated the use of iConnect within a home setting and assessed the generalization of the device with a caregiver. The participant in the study, Ron, was a 13-year-old 8th grade student with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders. Ron engaged in high levels of off-task behaviors such as gazing, getting out of a seat, disturbing members of the house, and refusal to comply, and demonstrated low executive functioning skills such as organization, problem solving, staying on task, and completing a task while working on homework in the home setting. This study took place in the home setting of Ron, and we provided 2 chairs and a table to conduct sessions and complete the homework assignments. The implementation of iConnect to train the student: first, Ron recorded his behavior from the videotape sessions of baseline on the iConnect application, and then compared the results with the researcher. Once Ron met the criteria of 80% matching accuracy across 3 sessions, the intervention sessions began. Now, with the parent, the researchers taught the parent how to log into the iConnect application. They conducted matching sessions with Ron, and they were trained to follow a modified fidelity treatment form from the iConnect website. Here are the results of Ron's on-task behavior during the study. As you can see, on the x-axis, we have sessions. On the y-axis, we have percentage of on-task behavior. First, you may notice in the first baseline phase that Ron's on-task behavior is highly variable but low. Once we introduced iConnect, Ron's on-task behavior increased to an average of 97%. When iConnect was removed again, Ron's on-task behavior was an average of 24%. And once we added the iConnect application into Ron's sessions for the second time, his average on-task percentage was 95%. Finally, we had the generalization phase with the caregiver, which Ron's behavior was at 72% on task. I am about to show you 2 short video clips of Ron The first video clip is run during his baseline sessions without IConnect, and the second video will be the intervention sessions with the IConnect application.
In what ways did the Andrew Jackson make the United States more democratic? Consider who could vote. 0 points.
He made rules that everybody has to follow.
Good job, honey. Make sure you get it, Thomas.
Okay.
Good job.
Positivity. What did you do well? Acknowledge the progress you have made. In one brief sentence, tell me what you did today that you feel confident about.
I pay attention in class.
The purpose of this study was to examine and extend the effects of IConnect to increase on-task behavior as well as academic performance. As mentioned previously, IConnect has been implemented in the school setting, but as a result of this study, IConnect can be used in the home setting in which sessions are implemented by caregivers. Future research may also aim to employ IConnect with caregivers as the only implementer.
Great, thank you, John. I think it's important to mention that the dramatic results that John saw in his study are consistent with the findings that we saw in our other studies and the same reports that we get from users in the field. When students learn how to self-monitor and use self-monitoring, we can see drastic improvements in their learning, social, emotional, and behavioral goals. If you want to learn more about how to use IConnect, we have a ton of resources on our website, including these user guides that walk you through the entire process of setting up a student and providing guidance and troubleshooting for setting intervals, selecting target behaviors, and more. These guides are individualized for various IConnect users, including a mentor or a teacher, as we talked about earlier today, as well as non-school district providers, such as outside service providers or home providers and parents. But also we have a user guide for students who would like to be autonomous users, so students who just want to use this on their own and don't want teachers or parents involved in it. There's methods for them to do that. And we also have a pretty extensive guide for using IConnect on an implementation team or scaling it up across a district or a school or even a program where you would train multiple mentors to use IConnect with multiple students and use the data to drive program decisions. So we have all of these resources, these user guides available on our website. They're all free to download, and there's a ton of other videos that walk you through how to set up a student, how to use the web portal. We have screen demos where we show you how to use the app and what the app looks like. So we have a ton of resources, and we invite you guys to check out our website, iconnect.ku.edu. Thank you so much for learning with us, and I hope you have a great rest of your conference.